All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at something pretty fundamental, I think, to how we understand the world. We're going to be looking at cultural evolution.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I guess this is sort of at the intersection of a lot of really interesting fields,
Right.
right? We're talking about cognitive science, we're talking about
Yes.
anthropology, we're talking about evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
And I guess really the question that's at the core of all this is like, how and why do humans learn from each other? And how does that process drive change over time?
Yeah, and I think for, our listeners who are more philosophically inclined, I think this is an area that's really ripe with really interesting questions because it really cuts to the core of what does it even mean for something to evolve? What is culture to begin with?
Right. And how do we even go about answering that question? Like, what are the right tools to use to understand cultural evolution? I mean, I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about cultural evolution is that it's such a contentious field. You know, there's a lot of debate about how we should even go about studying it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's kind of our mission today for this deep dive is to kind of lay out some of those core concepts, look at some of the major points of contention, and just kind of explore how, different researchers are approaching this topic.
Yeah, and I think, in the course of this, we can sort of think about how, a philosophical understanding of things like, what is knowledge? How does change happen?
Mm.
What is the nature of culture?
Right.
How can those sorts of philosophical insights help us to, get a better grasp on what's going on with cultural evolution?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess just to give our listeners a kind of a roadmap of where we're going to be going, we're going to start by looking at the relationship between natural selection, kind of the bedrock of biological evolution, and culture. And then from there, we're going to kind of dive into what is culture and what does it mean for culture to evolve.
Yeah.
And, what are those mechanisms of transmission? How is culture passed on?
Right. And I think after that, we can sort of move into um, some of the more specific ideas within cultural evolution, like the idea of memes, which is, I think, probably the most well-known concept from cultural evolution. But we're also going to look at other frameworks like dual inheritance theory and cultural attraction.
Right.
We'll look at, what we call the systems perspective. And finally, we'll sort of step back and think about some of the bigger philosophical questions about, like, how far can this analogy between biology and culture really take us?
Right, exactly. So let's jump right in with this idea of natural selection and culture. So, Darwin obviously used natural selection to explain the emergence of complex adaptive traits in the biological world, and his core insight was that there's differences in survival and reproduction, and then also offspring tend to resemble their parents in the traits that are relevant to survival.
Right. And I guess what's really striking about Darwin's original formulation of natural selection is that he didn't actually specify how that resemblance between parents and offspring happens.
Right.
He left it open. It could be through genes, or as he himself observed, it could be through learning. So from the perspective of natural selection, the underlying mechanism of inheritance didn't really matter. What mattered was just the observable fact of resemblance in traits that are relevant to survival.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because he actually extended this concept beyond the biological realm. So he was suggesting that natural selection could operate on entities other than organisms. He specifically pointed to language change as something that could be shaped by similar selective pressures. He quotes Max Miller, who talked about a struggle for life among word and grammatical forms. And so he was saying that, the better, shorter, easier forms gain prevalence due to their inherent virtue, quote unquote.
And I think, what's really interesting about that is that Darwin wasn't just speaking metaphorically here. I mean, he explicitly states that the survival of favored words in the struggle for existence, this is natural selection.
Wow.
And so, this is a really, really powerful notion because it suggests that, the fundamental principles of evolutionary change, they might have a much broader applicability than we typically think. They might extend beyond just the realm of biology.
Yeah, I mean, it really makes you think about this substrate neutrality of natural selection, as it's often called. Those fundamental requirements, variation, inheritance, differential success, those could potentially apply to a whole range of entities, not just, genes and
I was
organisms.
like, exactly. So while, not all theorists within cultural evolution will necessarily sort of buy into this strong analogy between, natural selection and cultural change, a lot of them do find it, really valuable to try to adapt, models and tools from evolutionary biology to gain insight into culture. And they point out that there are a lot of interesting parallels, right?
Right.
So you have, variation in cultural practices. You have the inheritance of those practices through learning.
Mm.
And you have the observation that, some practices seem to be more successful or more widespread than others.
Yeah, but of course, drawing those parallels is just the beginning. I mean, as you, with your philosophical training, will immediately recognize, I mean, this opens up a whole host of really, really thorny questions. I mean,
Yeah.
there's terms like culture, transmission, even evolution. Those are all very, very complex, and they're subject to lots of different interpretations.
Right.
And so I think, the question then becomes, what is this culture that's evolving, and what does it even mean for culture to evolve, and what are those specific mechanisms that are at play?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, I think, we have to start with this basic question of like, what is culture?
Hmm.
I mean, this is a question that philosophers and researchers, because all sorts of disciplines have been grappling with for a long time. And there's no single universally accepted definition of culture.
Hmm.
The term culture gets used in so many different ways, whether we're talking about philosophy or the humanities or empirical research.
Yeah, and it's like, you could be talking about someone's, skill in baking a specific type of bread, or you could be talking about, an entire, culture of baking in a particular region.
Right.
And those are clearly different levels of analysis.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think, we have to distinguish between sort of individual level cultural traits,
Yeah.
the actual skills and knowledge and behaviors that individuals have, versus kind of group level phenomena, right? So like the shared norms and practices of a particular community. And a lot of times the term culture is used to sort of encompass both of those things.
Right.
And that can lead to a lot of conceptual confusion.
Yeah, and it's not just about different levels of analysis, but it's also about the kind of the function that culture is seen as serving. I mean, is it a medium for information? Is it the kind of background context in which certain practices have meaning? Is it just, the kind of strategies that groups develop to navigate their local environment? There's all sorts of different ways of thinking about the function of culture.
Right. And so, I think for our purposes, if we sort of focus on researchers who are specifically working within the field of cultural evolution, there is a sort of relatively common definition that gets used. And this is a definition that was articulated by Richardson and Boyd, who are, two of the sort of, pioneers in the field.
Right.
And they define culture as information capable of affecting individuals' behavior that they acquire from other members of their species through teaching, imitation, and other forms of social learning.
Right. So it's this information, which I guess would reside at the individual level, but it's socially acquired.
Right.
And it influences how we act.
Yeah. And this information can be embodied in all sorts of different ways.
Right.
It can be in our minds, but it can also be in, artifacts,
Yeah.
Material objects, things like that.
Right. Yeah. And so, while cultural evolutionists might talk about group level culture, they typically understand that as kind of an aggregation. It's a way of describing the collective of cultural information that's held by individuals within that group. And the group itself might be defined by other things like, ethnicity or shared identity.
Right.
So this emphasis on information as the foundation of culture, I mean, it's very interesting. It seems like a kind of a powerful framework.
Yeah.
But it also raises some tricky philosophical issues, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one question is like, okay, well, what is this information that we're talking about? And Boyd and Richardson, they give us sort of descriptions that talk about things like, any kind of mental state, conscious or not, that is acquired or modified by social learning and affects behavior. But they also acknowledge that, cultural information can be stored in artifacts.
Right.
And then that kind of starts to blur those conceptual boundaries a little bit.
Yeah.
And if we look at their earlier definition of information as, something where energetically minor causes have energetically major effects, you can also find some counterexamples to that. So, for instance, you think about the amount of effort and resources that go into producing a scholarly paper.
Right.
That's a very, very energetically significant cause. But the actual written inscription itself, you might say, well, that's a relatively energetically minor effect.
Right.
So, I think there's some real questions about, how we should understand this idea of information.
Yeah, I mean, it gets even trickier when you start trying to distinguish between something, acting as an information bearer versus, other elements that might be involved in the process, like an information reader or just a background condition that enables transmission. So it seems like information is a very slippery concept in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, the very slipperiness of the term information
Yeah.
is both a strength and a potential weakness, right?
Right.
On the one hand, it allows for a lot of different interpretations. It makes it really easy to sort of borrow ideas across disciplines, including from biology. So, for instance, if we look at, major evolutionary transitions in biology, sometimes those are characterized in terms of shifts in how inherited information is stored and transmitted.
Right.
And so, there's been some really interesting work on the emergence of language as itself a kind of informational transition.
Hmm.
And so, that suggests that there might be some really deep connections between biological and cultural evolution at this sort of fundamental level of how information is stored and transmitted.
Yeah. So, I mean, while this information perspective is, it definitely has some challenges.
Mm.
It does, I think open up some really interesting possibilities for connecting cultural change to those broader evolutionary principles.
Right.
So let's move on to the mechanisms of transmission and inheritance.
Uh,
So, how is this cultural information actually disseminated?
Right.
So the source material kind of points to two major ways of approaching this.
Okay.
So the first approach is to focus on the content of the information itself, and in particular, whether it involves, the use of symbols. So, for example, Jablonka and Lamb, they argue that, a really defining characteristic of human cultural transmission is our reliance on symbolic systems.
Right.
So, while animals might learn behaviors socially, like, birds learning songs,
Hmm.
those songs don't have the same kind of symbolic meaning that human language does. Right.
Yeah.
So, like, the word tree doesn't physically resemble a tree.
Mhm.
It's this arbitrary symbol that we've all kind of collectively agreed to use to represent that concept. And they suggest that this arbitrariness can actually speed up cultural change
Right.
because we can substitute symbols more easily.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like the difference between having, a physical map of a city
Right.
and having like a Google Maps, digital representation of the city.
Right.
Like you can change the digital representation much more easily than you can change the physical map.
Right. Right. And they point out, too, that some symbols do have a degree of what they call iconicity. So, like, a sign for an airport that depicts an airplane.
Hmm.
And those might be more resistant to change because there's that kind of physical resemblance there.
Right. Right.
But in general, they argue that the symbolic capacity, especially as it's manifested in language, has really profoundly shaped human cultural evolution
Hmm.
because it allows for this incredible diversity of meaningful communication. We can combine symbols in almost limitless ways, and then also we can store symbolic information externally, right?
Mm,
So,
yeah.
in books and databases and libraries, and that allows for this incredible accumulation of knowledge over generations. But again, as you might expect, I mean, even this notion of symbolic transmission, it's not without its own philosophical complexities. Trying to define precisely what constitutes a symbolic system and how it relates to other forms of inheritance, like the genetic code.
Hmm.
I mean, that gets really tricky.
That's it. That's right.
So the second major approach to thinking about cultural transmission is to shift the focus from the content of the information to the channel.
Right.
So, how is the information actually being conveyed?
Right.
And so this often involves defining cultural inheritance in terms of, information that's transmitted via social learning,
Hmm.
as distinct from, genetic inheritance or other channels.
Hmm.
But then the question becomes, what is social learning?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question, and Henrik offers a really, I think, helpful definition where he contrasts this with individual learning. So he says social learning is any time that an individual's learning is influenced by others. And that can encompass a whole range of psychological processes. Individual learning, on the other hand, is learning through direct interaction with the environment.
Right.
So, if you're learning to ride a bike and you're just sort of, figuring it out on your own, that would be individual learning.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're learning to ride a bike and you're watching your older sibling ride a bike and you're kind of picking up tips from them,
Mm-hmm.
that would be social learning.
Right. But Henrich himself, he acknowledges that social and individual learning, they're not really mutually exclusive, especially in our species.
Right.
I mean, almost everything in our environment, even the things that we learn from directly, has been shaped by the actions of others in the past, right? I mean, our buildings, our domesticated plants and animals, the landscapes that we inhabit. I mean, all of those things bear the imprint of previous human activity.
Yeah. I mean, so it's almost like, our environment itself is culturally shaped.
Right.
And so even individual learning is taking place within a kind of culturally mediated context.
Right. Right. So as that boundary between social and individual learning gets blurrier, then it also makes it, harder to have this clear concept of a separate cultural channel of inheritance.
Right, exactly.
So this has led researchers to try to identify kind of more specific characteristics of different types of social learning. So, Henrich, for example, he distinguishes what he calls cultural learning as a more sophisticated form of social learning where individuals are actively seeking to acquire information from others.
Right.
But even this distinction has been criticized. Some people argue that, individual learning, but within a structured environment, that might actually be just as sophisticated, maybe even more sophisticated than just simply copying others. So I think, it's still an open question whether social learning really involves, some kind of additional cognitive complexity, and whether it really is more effective at generating those, increasingly refined cultural traits over time.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about information and we've talked about transmission.
Right.
Let's move on to another kind of crucial aspect of evolution, whether it's, biological or cultural, and that's reproduction and selection.
Okay.
So, the source material suggests that there's kind of less consensus when it comes to culture here than there is for those ideas about information and transmission.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, you have some real skeptics out there like Fracchia and Lewontin, for example, who argue that, there aren't really any good analogies to biological reproduction and natural selection in the cultural realm at all. And so they see this as a real weakness of the cultural evolution framework. They think it kind of undermines its predictive and explanatory power.
Yeah.
And their argument is basically that trying to kind of shoehorn culture into an evolutionary mold just ignores the really important role of things like social power dynamics.
Right.
And the unique historical context of cultural change. And they say, we should really be focusing on understanding cultural change as an inherently historical process. So that's sort of, one end of the spectrum. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, you have, proponents of cultural evolution who offer different levels of analogy between biological and cultural evolution, ranging from, very, very broad to very, very specific.
Right.
So Cradier, Scott Phillips, and Sperber, they lay out kind of four different frameworks.
Okay.
So you have populational frameworks, which just sort of look at changes in the prevalence of cultural traits.
Right.
So these could be ideas or artifacts or behaviors. How do those change over time? And then you have what they call evolutionary approaches, which are kind of a subset of populational approaches.
Okay.
And they posit that, the current distribution of traits can be explained by looking at their distribution in the recent past.
Okay.
And then you have selectional approaches, which you go even further. And they say that, some form of cultural natural selection is what explains those shifts in prevalence. So the idea is that, some traits are just more fit within their cultural environment than others.
Okay.
And then finally, you have replicator approaches, which, we'll talk more about when we get to memes.
Right.
But basically, replicator approaches assume that, cultural evolution operates on specific cultural replicators. So things that kind of create copies of themselves in a way that's analogous to genes.
Right. So it seems like, a lot of the work that's being done in cultural evolution these days, it tends to favor that that broader populational framework.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily require there to be like strict cultural replicators.
Right.
But even within that framework, there's still a lot of different views about how and why certain cultural traits become more common. So some researchers focus on the psychological biases that influence, how individuals learn and adopt traits, and they look at how those, individual level biases can then lead to population level shifts.
Yeah, and other researchers, they recognize the limitations of a strict selectional analogy.
Right.
And they explore mechanisms that are kind of similar to natural selection, but not identical.
Okay.
So, one example of this is the idea of persistence or stickiness.
Mm-hmm.
So some ideas or practices, even after we've learned lots of other ideas and practices, they tend to stick around longer.
Mm-hmm.
Like a cherished family recipe that
Yeah.
gets used over and over again.
Right.
And so, that stickiness, it's not exactly the same as natural selection,
Right.
but it still plays a role in determining which cultural traits are more prevalent.
Right. And then there's also the question of cultural reproduction.
Mhm.
Unlike biological reproduction, which I guess, in general is a more passive process,
Right.
cultural transmission often involves these active agents who are making choices about what to learn and what to reconstruct and what to transmit.
Hmm.
So this element of agency raises some real questions about how far that biological analogy can really be stretched.
Mhm.
So if cultural selection is, it's dependent on these agent-driven processes, and if those processes are heavily influenced by, cultural history and context, then, maybe evolutionary explanations aren't really adding that much to what social scientists are already doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. I mean, if all that cultural selection ends up doing is kind of describing the same factors that psychologists and sociologists are already studying, in terms of individual motivations and social influences, but it's just describing them in this kind of evolutionary language.
Right.
Then what's the added value of the evolutionary framework?
Right.
I mean, the question is, can a selective explanation really tell us something about why certain cultural traits are so well suited
Mm,
to particular groups and their environments?
right.
Or are historical and agent-centered explanations ultimately more illuminating?
Yeah. So this kind of brings us to the concept of memes, which is that, strong analogy
Yeah.
that we were mentioning earlier. And this is, I guess, probably the most widely recognized attempt to apply evolutionary thinking to culture.
Right.
And it's largely thanks to the work of Richard Dawkins.
Right. So Dawkins, in his book The Selfish Gene, he argued that just as genes are the replicators of biological evolution,
Mm-hmm.
that there must be cultural replicators as well.
Mm-hmm.
And he called these memes.
Right.
And he defined them very broadly as units of cultural transmission. And he gave all sorts of examples. He talked about, tunes and ideas and catchphrases and clothing fashions and ways of making things.
Right. And so, the basic idea is that these memes, they kind of hop from mind to mind.
Hmm.
And as they spread, they're creating copies of themselves. And just as genes replicate at different rates depending on their effects on the organisms that carry them, Dawkins argued that memes replicate at different rates based on their effects on individuals and their environment. So, I mean, you can think about how a catchy melody can spread really, really quickly through a population.
Right.
Or you could even think about the spread of a scientific hypothesis from a mimetic perspective.
Hmm.
Some hypotheses are more fit, maybe because they have greater predictive power or they're, simpler.
Right.
And those tend to be adopted more widely within the scientific community. So the meme's eye view kind of suggests that we can see this as a competition among these selfish memes that are all striving to be copied.
Right. Right. And I think, that view has a certain intuitive appeal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we can all sort of relate to the idea that ideas can spread like viruses.
Right.
But as our source material points out, while meme theory has gotten a lot of sort of popular attention,
Yeah.
it hasn't really been widely adopted within scientific circles. And there are some pretty big challenges to this idea of memes as strict replicators.
Right.
So one of the biggest criticisms is it really true that cultural units are replicators in the same way that genes are.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, do they really produce like high-fidelity copies of themselves? And critics like Sperber, for example, they argue that the mechanisms of cultural transmission, like imitation, for example, they're often too prone to error to really support true replication.
Yeah, I was just thinking about like the example of our Victoria sponge cake that we talked about earlier. So if you taste a cake that's made from this, secret family recipe and then you try to recreate it,
Yeah.
the chances are your version's not going to be an exact replica, even if it tastes pretty similar.
Right. Exactly. And another issue is that even when similar ideas do spread, it's not always because they're being literally copied.
Right.
Sometimes it's more about recognition and recall. So, you taste the cake, you like it, and then you decide to bake one yourself. But you do that because you already know how to make a Victoria sponge cake.
Right.
The original cake just kind of triggered a recipe that was already in your repertoire.
Right.
So there's not actually any direct copying of a recipe going on there.
Right. Right. So this kind of leads to Sperber's idea of attractors. And his argument is that the recurrence of cultural traits, it often arises not from, this kind of literal copying, but from these shared patterns of thought, which he calls attractors, that lead to similar representations spreading.
Right.
So learning becomes more about kind of reconstruction, where we're inferring, we're rebuilding a trait based on our observations. And those reconstructions are biased by our existing mental frameworks, which kind of push them towards these more attractive states.
Right. So, going back to the doll example, if you're familiar with Indian cuisine,
right,
you might be able to recreate a doll that you've tasted without ever actually seeing the recipe. Your existing knowledge and preferences, they're acting as attractors, and they're kind of guiding your reconstruction towards something that's similar.
Right. So, I mean, these issues of imperfect imitation and this kind of non-replicative recurrence, I mean, they pose